At Murphy's Diner, Grace Evans, a compassionate waitress, secretly feeds Henry, a hungry boy, using her own tips. Her kindness draws harsh judgment from her manager, Steve, and customers who mock her intentions, accusing her of theft. Tensions peak as whispers of disapproval spread, with no one defending Grace. Just as humiliation engulfs her, an army jeep arrives, hinting at a dramatic shift. Who is the mysterious figure stepping out? Will Grace's quiet heroism be vindicated, or will small-town judgment prevail? The diner holds its breath, waiting for truth to unravel in this heart-stirring tale of compassion. Share your own stories of compassion in the comments and spread this video to inspire others. Let's make kindness louder than judgment. Join us at QH, where small acts create big change. In the heart of a small town where fields stretched endlessly and dreams often faded into the horizon, Murphy's Diner stood as a humble beacon of routine. On a biting winter morning, frost etched delicate webs across the diner's windows, catching the pale sunlight. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting sense of sizzling pancakes, brewing coffee, and the faint hum of an old radio crooning scratchy tunes from decades past. The diner buzzed with its usual crowd, weathered farmers in flannel, elderly regulars cradling steaming mugs, and a few high schoolers sneaking in before the school bell. Amid this familiar rhythm, Grace Evans, a 32-year-old waitress, wove through the tables with a quiet grace, born of years navigating crowded booths and fleeting glances. Grace's blonde hair was swept into a neat ponytail, her slight frame nearly swallowed by the faded gray uniform she wore like a second skin. Her eyes, kind yet guarded, rarely lingered on anyone's face, a reflex honed by a life of serving others while shielding herself. Every step she took was deliberate, her hands steady as she balanced plates and refilled mugs. But beneath her calm exterior churned a heart heavy with unspoken stories. She had grown up in a home where love was scarce and survival meant keeping your head down. The diner, for all its chaos, was her refuge, a place where she could offer the warmth she'd never received. In the far corner booth, tucked away from the clamor, sat Henry, an 11-year-old boy whose presence was as unassuming as a shadow. His oversized coat, patched and fraying, hung loosely on his narrow shoulders, as if trying to shield him from the world. His dark hair, overgrown and unruly, fell into his eyes, which carried a weight no child should bear, a sadness carved by years of growing up too fast. Each morning, Henry ordered only a glass of water, spreading his worn textbooks across the scratched table, his pencil scratching quietly as he worked. To the other patrons, he was just another kid, invisible in his silence. But to Grace, he was a quiet reminder of the world's overlooked corners. For weeks, Grace had upheld a secret ritual, one that anchored her through the long shifts and meager tips. Each morning, she'd prepare a meal for Henry, a ham sandwich, fluffy scrambled eggs, and a glass of orange juice, slipping it onto his table with a soft smile. She'd scrawl charity on the receipt and cover the cost from her own earnings, a small act that felt like defiance against the indifference around her. Henry never spoke, but his eyes, wide and grateful, said everything. Their unspoken pact was sealed in silence, a fragile thread of trust woven between two souls who understood the cost of kindness. This morning, however, that thread snapped. As Grace set Henry's plate down, the clatter of the diner was pierced by a sharp voice. Steve Morrison, the 45-year-old manager, emerged from his cramped office, his thinning hair slicked back and his face etched with a perpetual scowl. "Grace!" His voice thundered across the room, slicing through conversations and turning heads. "This ain't a soup kitchen. You can't just hand out free food to strays." The word strays landed like a slap, and Grace's cheeks burned as every eye in the diner fixed on her. Her hands, clutching the crumpled charity receipt, trembled, and her heart pounded with a mix of shame and defiance. "I paid for it myself," she whispered, but her voice was swallowed by the rising tide of judgment. The diner, once a haven, transformed into a stage for cruelty. Sarah, a younger waitress with perfectly lined lips and calculating eyes, leaned against the coffee station, her voice carrying just far enough to sting. "She's probably fishing for attention," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to smirk. "Playing the saint to boost her tips." A woman in a crisp business suit, her breakfast half-eaten, pulled out her phone and snapped a photo of Grace and Henry, her voice dripping with disdain. "Bet she's probably laundering from the till for her kids' project," she said to her companion, who chuckled darkly. The whispers spread like wildfire, each word a spark that fueled Grace's humiliation. An elderly man in overalls perched on a counter stool shook his head. "Kids these days need to learn the hard way. Charity just makes them soft." Grace stood frozen beside Henry's frozen by the boy's burden. Her fingers, seeking comfort, found a worn pencil tucked in her apron pocket. Gift from Henry, given weeks ago in a rare moment of connection. "For the nicest lady I know," he'd whispered, his small hand pressing the pencil into her palm of hers. The memory anchored her too, but it seemed couldn't shield her from the sting of her betrayal from the crowd around her or from Henry's coworkers and customers cut deeper than their words. Henry, too, was caught in his own storm. His face flushed with red shame that wasn't belonged to him, his own eyes fixed on to the food before him. The sandwich, a token of care from, now felt like a spotlight shining on his own vulnerability. He shrank further into his coat, too, as if he could to vanish entirely, his small hands clutching the table's edge. The weight of judgment from Diner's gaze pressed down on him, a boy already burdened by a world that seemed to demand too much. Steve, basking in his fleeting moment of control, the two crossed his arms. "Next time, or he, that boy, pays full price, or he finds somewhere else," he declared to, his voice final. The diner's cruel drama seemed ready poised to drag on forever, each patron playing out their part in the spectacle. But beyond outside, frosted beyond windows, frost-laced glass, a change was brewing. Dust swirled around in the gravel lot outside, kicks stirred by the deep, steady rumble of an unlike engine, distinct unlike from the familiar usual trucks. An army vehicle, rugged Jeep, weathered but meticulously cared for, rolled into the lot view, its presence arrival like a sudden blade cutting through the quiet diner's tension like a knife. Grace's heart, weary but unyielding, stirred with a faint spark of hope. She didn't know what this meant, but in this moment that it felt like a lifeline, a hint that the world outside might still hold a piece of something kind. In the Evans household, love wasn't counted in lavish gifts or overflowing pantries. It was measured in the hollow echo of empty cupboards. Mary Evans, Grace's mother, poured every ounce of herself into keeping their fragile world afloat. She juggled freedoms, her days a blur of scrubbing floors, serving coffee, and ladling soup at a church kitchen. Yet, some weeks, even that relentless grind fell short. Grace, at 8 years old, would sit at their wobbly kitchen table, her small hands clutching a spoon, watching her mother carefully split a single can of watery soup between them. Mary would push the bowl toward Grace, her smile thin but warm, insisting she wasn't hungry. "You need it more, sweetheart," she'd say, her voice soft but firm, though Grace could see the exhaustion carving lines into her mother's face. It was a quiet sacrifice, one that planted a seed deep in Grace's heart, a seed that would grow into a life defined by giving. When Grace was 10, a pivotal moment reshaped their lives. Mary landed a job at the church's soup kitchen, a place where the air smelled of warm bread and second chances. It paid just enough to keep their fridge from staying bare, but it was more than a paycheck for Mary. She'd come home bone-tired, her apron dusted with flour, her pockets stuffed with dinner rolls she'd saved for Grace. Those rolls were treasures, each one a testament to Mary's unspoken vow to always provide, no matter the cost to herself. One night, as she tucked Grace into bed, Mary's voice dropped to a whisper, her words heavy with meaning. "If you ever have even one extra bite, you share it with someone who has nothing. That's how we keep our hearts full," said Gracie. Grace clung to those words, feeling their weight settle into her soul. They weren't just advice, they were a blueprint for living. Mary Evans' heart gave out when Grace was 17, worn thin by years of overwork. The loss was a jagged wound, one Grace carried alongside a faded photograph of her mother. In the picture, Mary stood outside the church in 1995, her apron flecked with flour, her hands outstretched with sandwiches for homeless children. Her smile was weary but radiant, a beacon of kindness that didn't demand applause. To Grace, that image was a lighthouse, guiding her through the years that followed. For 15 years, across 3 states, Grace carried her mother's lesson like a torch. Waitressing in diners from dusty roadside stops to small-town greasy spoons, she found ways to give. She'd cover a trucker's coffee when his card was declined, her heart aching at the shame in his eyes. She'd slip extra bacon onto a pregnant woman's plate, sensing the hunger she tried to hide. She'd give her own employee meal to anyone who needed it more, her stomach growling but her spirit full. Kindness to Grace was as natural as breathing, but she learned painfully that not everyone saw it that way. At Murphy's Diner, Grace's quiet generosity drew attention. Not all of it kind. Henry, a boy who often lingered at the counter, became the unwitting center of the town's gossip. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, hand-me-downs that never quite fit. His school lunches were meager, sometimes just a bruised apple or a half-eaten sandwich. Teachers at his school clucked their tongues, labeling him a charity case in hushed tones. Some parents steered their children away from him, as if poverty were a disease they might catch. Grace overheard one teacher in the grocery store, her voice dripping with pity. "That Carter boy looks like he hasn't eaten a proper meal in days. Someone ought to call social services." The words stung Grace, who knew the truth. Henry's father was deployed overseas, and his grandmother, his sole caretaker, stretched a fixed income to cover rent and her medications. Every dollar was a choice between survival and sacrifice. Grace's small acts of kindness toward Henry, slipping him an extra slice of pie or a warm roll, sparked cruel whispers. At the post office, Mrs. Henderson's voice carried over the hum of the sorting machine. "That Grace girl's just fishing for attention, playing the savior to feel important. It's not like she's changing anyone's life." The words cut deep, each one a betrayal of Grace's quiet mission. The humiliation didn't stay confined to the town's gossip mill. Last month, Steve, the diner's manager, called Grace into his office, his eyes fixed on paperwork to avoid her gaze. "Mrs. Rodriguez complained you're making customers uncomfortable," he said, his tone clipped. "She thinks you're letting that boy hang around too long, creating an unsanitary environment." Grace's chest tightened, her hands twisting in her lap. "Henry's just a kid who needs a little help," she started, but Steve cut her off. "Henry's needs aren't our problem, Grace. This is a business, not a charity. Customers are noticing, and it's hurting our image." The reprimand felt like a slap, but it wasn't the worst of it. The diner's staff didn't hold back their disapproval. During slow shifts, Grace caught snippets of their whispers, conversations that halted when she neared. One morning, she overheard Sarah, a fellow waitress, leaning close to the cook. "Some people do good for all the wrong reasons." Makes you wonder what Grace is trying to prove. The words lingered, heavy and sharp, eroding the quiet pride Grace took in her work. Even customers joined the chorus of doubt. That morning, a woman snapped a photo of Henry at the counter, her lips pursed as she muttered to her friend, "I bet Grace is skimming from the register to fund her little charity stunts." The accusation was a gut punch, revealing how quickly kindness could be twisted into something ugly. Grace felt the weight of their judgment, each whisper and glance chipping away at her resolve. Yet deep down, she clung to her mother's words, refusing to let the world's cynicism dim her light. But one person was beginning to see Grace differently. Lisa Martinez, a 17-year-old trainee server, had started at Murphy's with the same skepticism as the others. She'd absorbed the gossip, her eyes narrowing as she watched Grace, waiting for some selfish motive to reveal itself. Lisa had grown up hearing adults trade rumors, their words sharp and certain, and she assumed Grace's generosity was a performance, a way to earn praise or mask some hidden agenda. But as she worked alongside Grace, Lisa saw something else. She noticed Grace eating peanut butter sandwiches from a jar she kept in her locker, her own meals sacrificed to ensure others had enough. She saw the way Grace's face softened when she handed Henry a warm roll, her kindness unguarded and genuine. Lisa's suspicions began to crumble, replaced by a quiet awe. Grace wasn't chasing attention. She was living a truth Lisa hadn't yet understood, a truth that felt both simple and profound. Grace nibbled on butter crackers in the cramped break room of Murphy's Diner, her stomach grumbling, but her heart steady. She'd skipped a proper lunch to save a few dollars, ensuring Henry, the lanky 11-year-old with a shy smile, could have a real meal. something warm, something filling. Lisa, the young dishwasher with sharp eyes and a quieter soul, noticed everything. She saw Grace linger after her shift, scrubbing extra tables until her hands were raw, never asking for extra pay or even a thank you. Grace didn't complain. She just worked, her face etched with a tired determination that Lisa couldn't help but admire. But it was Henry who brought out something different in Grace, a spark in her hazel eyes that flared brightest when he grinned, his face lighting up at the sight of a plate of pancakes or a burger. That spark, Lisa thought, was what kept Grace going through the long, bone-weary shifts. One frosty afternoon, as Lisa wiped down a counter, she muttered to herself, maybe the adults have it all wrong. She was piecing together a picture of Grace, built from moments no one else seemed to notice. Grace always took the holiday shifts, Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, without a word, letting her coworkers go home to their kids and warm dinners while she poured coffee for strangers. When the diner was short-handed, she'd slip into the restrooms with a bucket and mop, cleaning up messes that weren't her responsibility. Her hands chapped from the harsh soap. Last month, Lisa had watched, stunned, as Grace shrugged off her own winter coat, threadbare but warm, and gave it to a homeless woman shivering outside the diner. For weeks after, Grace had shown up to work in just a thin sweater, her breath visible in the cold air, but she never complained. To Lisa, these weren't just kind acts. They were clues to a heart the rest of the town had misjudged. Yesterday, Henry had dashed out of the diner, late for the school bus, leaving his worn backpack behind on the booth. Grace had called after him, her voice soft but urgent, but he was already gone, his sneakers slapping against the pavement. The bag sat open, its contents spilling out. A faded photograph of a man in army dress blues, his face a mirror of Henry's, though hardened by a soldier's confidence. Next to it was a scratched military ID card, its edges soft from years of being touched, and a letter addressed to Henry Carter with a return address from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Lisa's heart raced as she looked at it, her mind spinning with questions. She didn't say a word, but she felt the weight of a story the adults had dismissed too quickly, their whispers about Grace's intentions fading against the evidence of her care. Outside, an Army Jeep's engine growled softly as it cooled in the parking lot, its olive green frame dusted with dirt from country roads. Through the diner's fogged-up windows, Lisa glimpsed a tall figure in military fatigues standing beside the vehicle. His posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on the diner with an intensity that spoke of a long journey and a deeper purpose. Inside, the diner's usual hum, clinking dishes, murmured conversations, fell silent when the door chime rang, sharper than usual. Captain John Carter stepped inside, his 6-foot frame filling the doorway. His army dress blues were crisp, though his boots carried the dust of a long drive. His eyes, sharp and weary, held the focus of someone who'd driven through the night, fueled by a single mission. The diner froze, spoons halted, voices cut off, as every eye turned to him. Captain Carter's gaze swept the room, slicing through the haze of grease and coffee steam until it found the corner booth. There was Henry, his small frame hunched over an untouched sandwich, his eyes wide with disbelief. Beside him stood Grace, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face draining of color as if she'd been caught in a spotlight she didn't want. Confusion flickered in her eyes, tinged with a fear she couldn't name, fear of being seen, of being judged. Captain Carter's expression softened when he saw his son, but his jaw stayed tight, a soldier's discipline anchoring him. His boots echoed on the linoleum as he crossed the room, each step drawing the diner's attention like a magnet. "Henry," he said, his voice warm but commanding, the kind that could hush a battlefield or soothe a scared child. "I got your letter." Henry's eyes filled with tears, his small body shaking as he sprang from the booth and wrapped his arms around his father's waist. "Dad, I didn't know you were coming home," he said, his voice breaking, muffled against the crisp fabric of his father's uniform. "Emergency leave," Captain Carter replied, his hand steady on Henry's shoulder, pulling him close. "Your grandmother called the base, said you'd been talking about a special lady who's been looking out for you." His eyes shifted to Grace, who stood rooted to the spot, clutching a crumpled charity receipt like it could shield her from the room's stares. Her cheeks burned red, embarrassment flooding her at being the center of attention. "You must be Grace," Captain Carter said, offering his hand. His tone carried a gratitude that made Grace's breath hitch. "I'm John Carter, Henry's father." She shook his hand, her fingers trembling, her voice barely audible. I, I just, he looked hungry," she managed, as if she needed to explain why she'd cared. Henry looked up, his voice steadying with pride. "She's been feeding me every day, Dad. When you were deployed and Grandma got sick, Grace made sure I had breakfast before school." His words were fierce, protective, his eyes shining with gratitude for the woman who'd stepped in when he needed it most. The diner seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with realization. Steve Morrison, the cook who'd been smirking behind the counter, enjoying Grace's discomfort, now found himself under Captain Carter's unyielding gaze. The room felt smaller, the truth of Grace's kindness settling over everyone like a heavy frost. Her quiet sacrifices, the meals she'd skipped, the coat she'd given away, all of it was real, undeniable, and now stood tall in the presence of a soldier who'd come to honor it. The diner was a small, unassuming place, its worn booths and chipped countertops bearing the weight of countless stories. But on this morning, the air was thick with something heavier than the usual hum of conversation and clinking dishes. Grace Evans, a waitress with tired eyes and a heart too big for her own good, stood at the center of a storm she hadn't seen coming. Just moments ago, the manager, Steve, had publicly berated her, his voice sharp with accusation. He'd called her a thief, a disgrace, all because she'd been slipping meals to a boy who came in hungry every day. The customers, quick to judge, had whispered and sneered, their phones flashing as they captured the spectacle. Grace's cheeks burned with shame, but she held her head high, her hands trembling as she clutched the pencil tucked behind her ear. She hadn't stolen a dime. She'd paid for every bite with her own tips, often skipping her own meals to make sure that Henry didn't go hungry. But no one knew that. Not yet. The door swung open and a man in a crisp army uniform stepped inside. Captain James Carter, a decorated officer whose presence seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. His boots hit the linoleum with purpose, his eyes scanning the diner until they landed on Steve. The manager's face drained of color, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Carter's gaze. This was no ordinary customer. This was a man who'd just returned from a 6-month deployment, a father whose son had been the subject of Steve's cruel tirade. Henry, the boy Grace had been feeding, was Carter's son, and the captain had heard enough. Carter turned to face the diner, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of authority that could hush a battlefield. "I want everyone here to understand something," he began, his words deliberate, each one landing with the weight of truth. "For the past 6 months, while I've been halfway across the world serving our country, this woman," he gestured toward Grace, who stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, "has been serving my son. Not for money, not for praise, but because she saw a child who needed help, and she stepped up when no one else did." The diner fell silent, the clatter of forks and the hiss of the coffee machine fading into the background. Grace felt her heart pound, a mix of fear and disbelief swirling in her chest. She'd never asked for recognition. She'd only wanted to make sure Henry had a warm meal, a moment of kindness in a world that hadn't been kind to him. The boy had come in every morning, his clothes a little too big, his eyes a little too hollow. Grace had seen herself in him, someone who knew what it was to go without, to feel invisible. So she'd started slipping him plates of eggs and toast, paying for them out of her own pocket, eating saltines and drinking water on her breaks to make ends meet. She hadn't told anyone, not even her coworkers. But now the truth was unraveling, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Carter reached into his uniform pocket, pulling out an envelope embossed with the Army seal. The sight of it sent a ripple through the crowd. "I've spent the last week working with the Armed Family Support Network," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "And today I'm here to make something right." He opened the envelope with a quiet reverence, as if the contents held more than just paper. "Grace Evans," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "by order of the base commander at Fort Bragg, you are hereby awarded the Army Family Support Pin for extraordinary civilian service to military families." Grace stared at the small pin he held out to her, its modest gleam catching the light. It was a rare honor, given only to those who went far beyond what was expected, who carried the weight of military families when soldiers couldn't. Her hands shook as she reached for it, her throat tight with tears she didn't trust herself to shed. The humiliation that had choked the diner moments before began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet awe. Customers who had whispered venom now sat speechless, their faces a mix of shame and wonder. "Ma'am," Carter said, his voice softening but still formal, "you fed my son when I couldn't. You gave him a reason to keep going when I was too far away to hold him up. In the Army, we have a saying, you've got someone's six. It means you've got their back no matter what. You've had my family's six for months, and I will never forget that." His words broke on the last syllable, and for a moment the hardened soldier looked like a father, raw and grateful. Steve, the manager, stepped forward, his face a mask of regret. "Captain, we had no idea. If we'd known," his voice faltered, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Carter's expression turned to stone as he faced him. "Known what?" he said, his tone sharp enough to cut. "That my son deserved to be treated like a human being? That this woman's kindness was worth respecting instead of tearing down?" Steve shrank back, his hands fidgeting, unable to meet Carter's gaze. Sarah, a waitress who had been the loudest in her criticism of Grace, approached next, her eyes red and brimming with tears. "Grace, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought I was wrong about everything." Her apology hung in the air, fragile but sincere. Grace looked at her, seeing not just the woman who judged her, but someone grappling with the weight of her own mistakes. It didn't erase the hurt, but it was a start. Then Lisa, the teenage trainee, stepped forward, her young face set with determination. She was barely 16, still learning the ropes of the diner, but her voice was clear and strong as she addressed the crowd. "I saw it all," she said, her words ringing with conviction. "For weeks I watched Grace. She never took a cent from the register. She paid for Henry's meals with her own money. I saw her eating crackers and drinking tap water so she could afford to give him real food." The diner seemed to hold its breath, Lisa's courage shining brighter than the neon sign outside. Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest, a flicker of pride for the girl who'd found her voice. A woman in the corner, the one who'd snapped a photo of Grace earlier, stood slowly, her phone trembling in her hands. I took a picture," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought she was stealing. I'm so sorry." With shaking fingers, she deleted the photo in front of everyone, the small act carrying a weight that seemed to shift the room's gravity. Grace watched, her heart softening despite the sting of betrayal. The woman's regret was real, and that was enough for now. An elderly farmer who had sat quietly through the morning's chaos rose to his feet, removing his weathered baseball cap. His hands were rough from years of work, but his voice was steady. "Ma'am," he said to Grace, "I've been coming here for 20 years, never seen anyone with a heart like yours." His words were simple, but they landed like a benediction, drawing nods from others in the crowd. One by one, customers began to stand. A young mother, her toddlers tugging at her sleeves, approached Grace with a shy smile. "Thank you for showing my kids what kindness looks like," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The transformation was remarkable. The people who had mocked and judged now offered apologies, their words clumsy but heartfelt. The diner's atmosphere shifted from one of malice to one of quiet shame, and then to something closer to reverence. Carter wasn't done. He reached for another document, his movements deliberate. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice regaining its commanding tone. "I've submitted Grace's story to the Army Community Service Awards program. Her actions embody the kind of civilian support that keeps military families strong." He handed her an official letter, its crisp folds bearing the weight of recognition. "This is a commendation that will be placed in the permanent records at Fort Bragg. Every military family stationed there will know about the waitress in a small town who took care of one of their own." Henry, who had been standing quietly by his father's side, looked up at Grace with eyes bright with pride and gratitude. "She's the reason I didn't give up, Dad," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Every morning she made me feel like I mattered." The words settled over the diner like a blanket, heavy with meaning. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks, no longer able to hold them back. She clutched the army pin and the letter, her heart swelling with a mix of exhaustion and joy. The pencil in her hand, the one she'd been gripping through it all, slipped to the floor, its quiet clatter a final note in the morning symphony. Grace didn't bend to pick it up. She didn't need to. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a waitress scraping by, but as someone who had made a difference. The small, worn gift tucked inside Grace's apron pocket, a simple token from Henry, felt like it carried the weight of the world. It wasn't just a trinket, it was a symbol of something far greater, proof that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. As she stood behind the counter of Murphy's Diner, her heart swelled with a quiet pride, tempered by the humility that had always defined her. "Kindness isn't weakness," she said, her voice soft at first, barely above a whisper, but growing steadier, bolder with each syllable. "It's the only thing that's ever made me strong." The words weren't just for the people in the diner, they were for herself, a reminder of the strength she'd found in years of giving without expectation. Captain Carter, his uniform crisp but his eyes warm with understanding, gave her a nod that spoke volumes. He'd seen heroes in battle, men and women who faced danger with unwavering courage. But this was different. "Heroes don't always wear uniforms, folks," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and admiration. "Sometimes they wear aprons." His words hung in the air, settling over the diner like a warm blanket, silencing the murmurs of the morning crowd. For Grace, it was a moment of validation, a rare acknowledgement of the quiet battles she fought every day to make others feel seen. Outside, the crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of a local news van, drawn by the buzz of social media posts that had already begun to spread Grace's story. What had started as a single act of compassion, Grace giving her own lunch to Henry, a boy who often went unnoticed, was now a beacon, a story of humanity that resonated far beyond the diner's walls. By midday, Murphy's Diner was no longer just a place to grab coffee and eggs. It was a symbol of redemption, a testament to the power of community healing in a world too often quick to judge. Steve Morrison, the diner's manager, stood in the center of it all, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the morning's events. He'd seen Grace endure snide comments and skeptical glances from coworkers and customers alike, yet she'd never wavered. Humbled, he made a decision that would shift the diner's culture forever. Gathering his staff, he announced, "Starting today, we're launching a weekly community breakfast program. Free meals for any child who needs them, paid for by the diner, and Grace will lead it." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke her name, a rare glimpse into the respect he'd always felt but never voiced. The diner's owner, reached by phone, didn't just approve. He doubled down, spanning the initiative and designating a corner of the restaurant as the Wall of Kindness. There, Grace's Army family support pin was proudly displayed, right beside a faded 1985 photograph of her mother feeding homeless children, a legacy of compassion that now lived on in Grace. Lisa Martinez, a teenage regular at the diner, watched it all unfold with wide eyes and a heart full of awe. She'd seen Grace's quiet heroism firsthand, the way she'd slipped her own lunch to Henry without fanfare, without expecting anything in return. Inspired, Lisa took to social media, launching a campaign called Kindness Louder Than Judgment. Her video, raw and heartfelt, recounted the moment she'd watched Grace sacrifice her meal for a boy who sat alone in the corner, his eyes downcast. The video exploded online, shared thousands of times, sparking similar programs in diners across 3 states. Lisa's own heart raced as she read the comments, each one a reminder that one small act could ignite a movement. She felt a fire in her chest, a determination to keep pushing, to make sure kindness was never drowned out by cruelty. Henry, the quiet boy who once hid in the shadows of the diner, found something new stirring inside him. No longer invisible, he carried Grace's gift in his pocket and her lesson in his heart. When his teacher asked him to speak to younger students about perseverance, he stood in front of the elementary school auditorium, his knees trembling but his voice steady. "When nobody else saw me, Miss Grace did," he said, his words simple but heavy with truth. "She taught me that being seen is the first step to being brave." The teacher, beaming with pride, recorded his speech, and soon it became part of the school district's anti-bullying curriculum, a testament to the power of one person's compassion to reshape a child's world. Captain Carter, before returning to his base, felt a pull to do more. Grace's story had touched him deeply, reminding him of the families he'd seen struggle during deployments. He established the Grace Evans Scholarship, a fund for children of deployed military personnel, kids like Henry who needed a community to lean on when their families were apart. The scholarship wasn't just financial aid, it required recipients to perform acts of service, creating a cycle of giving that would echo Grace's legacy. Carter imagined those kids, years from now, paying it forward, their small acts of kindness spreading like wildfire. Even the woman who had once deleted a photo of Grace's kindness, dismissing it as insignificant, found herself changed. She couldn't shake the image of Grace's quiet strength, and it stirred something in her. She started a local Facebook group called Caught Being Kind, a place for the community to share stories of everyday heroes. Grace's story was the first post, but it was quickly joined by hundreds more. Teachers dipping into their own wallets for school supplies, mechanics fixing cars for free, neighbors checking on elderly residents. Each story was a thread in a tapestry of compassion, woven together by a community learning to see the good in one another. Sarah, the waitress, who had once been Grace's harshest critic, felt a pang of regret that lingered long after the morning's events. She'd spent so much time picking apart Grace's actions, searching for flaws, that she'd missed the heart behind them. Determined to change, she began volunteering at the local food bank, her hands sorting cans while her mind replayed Grace's example. "I was so busy looking for what was wrong with her," she confided to friends, "that I didn't see what was right. I won't make that mistake again." Her transformation was quiet but profound, a shift that rippled through her own life and into the lives of those around her. An elderly farmer who had stood to honor Grace during the morning's events felt compelled to contribute in his own way. Every week he brought fresh vegetables from his farm, ensuring the community breakfast program always had nutritious options. His gesture inspired others. A local bakery donated bread, the grocery store supplied fruit, and the dairy delivered milk. The diner became a hub of generosity, each contribution a reminder that kindness could be contagious. The farmer, weathered by years of hard work, felt a renewed sense of purpose, his hands dirty from the soil but his heart full. Lisa's parents, once skeptical of their daughter's passion for the cause, found themselves transformed by the changes in their community. They became volunteers for the breakfast program, their initial doubts replaced by pride. "Our daughter showed us that sometimes the youngest voices carry the deepest truth," Lisa's mother told a local reporter, her eyes glistening with emotion. The words felt like a confession, an acknowledgement that they too had been changed by Grace's example. Murphy's Diner, once just a stop for coffee and pie, became something more, a pilgrimage site for military families. Word spread through base networks that there was a place where service members and their loved ones were not just welcomed, but celebrated. Grace found herself pouring coffee for parents sending their children to basic training, for wives navigating the loneliness of deployments, for veterans sharing stories of their own. Each conversation was a thread in the fabric of a community that had learned to hold each other up, inspired by a woman who had never sought the spotlight but had changed everything with her heart. Grace Evans paused each morning before her shift at Murphy's Diner, her fingers brushing the small frame pencil on the wall. It was a gift from Henry Carter, an 11-year-old boy whose quiet gratitude had changed everything. The inscription read, "For the nicest lady I know, who taught me kindness, makes us all stronger." Her heart swelled as she recalled her late mother, Mary, whose words, "Feed their souls, Gracie, not just their stomachs," had guided her to slip meals to Henry, a thin, reserved boy whose family struggled while his father, Captain John Carter, served at Fort Bragg. Grace used her own tips to cover those meals, driven by the ache she saw in Henry's eyes, a hunger she couldn't ignore. 6 months ago, her quiet generosity ignited a transformation. The Army base at Fort Bragg named Murphy's Diner its first civilian family support partner, a rare honor for a small-town eatery. This drew national attention, pulling reporters and visitors to the story of a waitress who fed a child, and in doing so, nourished a community's spirit. Grace felt both humbled and overwhelmed. She'd never sought attention, only to honor her mother's legacy of giving. Now, the diner's wall of kindness displayed hundreds of photos and notes from others inspired by her actions, a testament to the power of quiet heroism. On the first annual Community Gratitude Day, Murphy's buzzed with life. Military families, locals, and travelers packed every seat. Grace stood before them, her frayed apron a badge of honor, her voice steady yet warm. 6 months ago, I was just a waitress who got in trouble for giving a hungry kid pancakes, she said, recalling Steve Morrison's initial disapproval. The manager had once seen her actions as a liability, but now he was her biggest supporter. Today, I've learned from you all, she continued, gesturing to the wall of kindness, a mosaic of stories, a neighbor buying groceries for a stranger, a teacher tutoring after hours, a veteran fixing bikes for kids. Kindness doesn't need permission or praise. It needs courage to act, and it's contagious. When you choose compassion, others follow. Captain John Carter sat at the counter with Henry, now taller and more confident, his eyes bright with the security of being valued. John's heart ached with gratitude. Months earlier, a call from his mother-in-law had sent him racing home, fearing for his son. He found Henry at the diner, eating a meal Grace had quietly provided. She didn't just save his breakfast, John had told reporters, his voice breaking. She saved his trust in people. As a soldier, he valued discipline, but Grace's selflessness showed him a deeper strength. Watching Henry now, John felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Henry, once shy and downcast, stood beside Grace to speak. Miss Grace taught me that being hungry doesn't make you invisible, he said, gripping the microphone. Being kind makes you powerful. Now, when I see someone who needs help, I remember how good it felt to be seen. The crowd's applause roared, but Grace's heart held on to Henry's words, seeing her mother's legacy reflected in him. A boy who'd learned kindness could reshape the world. Steve Morrison, once focused on profits, now championed community service. I thought managing was about balancing books, he told the crowd, his voice earnest. Grace showed me it's about balancing humanity. Serving customers isn't the same as serving people. His regret for doubting her faded beneath gratitude for her lesson. The diner's community breakfast program, inspired by Grace, now fed dozens weekly, and Steve felt a pride he'd never known in his years of management. Lisa Martinez, the 17-year-old trainee server, scribbled notes in the back, her journalism scholarship fueled by Grace's example. Once unsure under Sarah's critical eye, Sarah, who'd warned that Grace's kindness would lead to trouble, Lisa now saw Grace's quiet strength as a call to be better. Documenting the event for her senior project on kindness's ripple effects, she felt a surge of purpose. She wanted to tell stories that mattered, to spotlight unsung heroes like Grace. The diner's impact reached beyond its walls. The state's Restaurant Association adopted Grace's guidelines, urging businesses to serve their communities. 12 regional diners launched breakfast programs modeled on Murphy's. Grace felt awe at this reach, her mother's lessons stretching far beyond her dreams. Mary, a woman of few words but boundless heart, had taught her that generosity was a legacy. As Grace heard stories from visitors, a teacher buying shoes, a mechanic fixing cars for single mothers, a librarian aiding readers at after hours, she felt Mary's presence. Kindness was a universal language, crossing state lines to touch countless lives. Outside, Henry helped his father load donated supplies into an army jeep, the same vehicle that had brought John home to his son. Once a symbol of urgency, it now carried hope, food and clothing for military families. Henry's hands worked alongside his father's, his heart lighter. Grace's kindness had been his beacon, guiding him through dark days. For John, watching his son's quiet confidence, it was a reminder that small acts held immense power. As Grace moved through the crowd, strangers shared their own stories of quiet heroism. She listened, her heart full, knowing her mother's lesson had traveled further than either could have imagined. If you have an extra bite, share it, she thought, echoing Mary. If someone needs to be seen, see them. And always choose compassion over judgment. You never know when you will need a stranger's kindness.